We'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Jonathan Buehler from Sunrider International, who will take the podium and introduce our first speaker. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I apologize for being late, and thank you, Lori, for sharing the reason why with the room. It's been an eventful time. It is really a big honor for Sunrider to be sponsoring today's event. This is something we look forward to so much every year. And it's my honor this morning to introduce one of the members of Congress who represents the city of Torrance, or portions of the city of Torrance. Elected in November 2016 to her 14th term in the U.S. House of Representatives, Congresswoman Maxine Waters serves as the ranking member of the House Committee on Financial Services. Throughout her 37 years of public service, Maxine has used her skill to shape public policy, including a $10 billion in Section 108 loan guarantees to cities for economic and infrastructure development, housing, and small business expansion, authoring legislation to expand health services for patients with diabetes, cancer, and Alzheimer's, spearheading the development of the Minority AIDS Initiative, authoring the Neighborhood Stabilization Program, which provides grants to states, local governments, and nonprofits to fight foreclosure, home abandonment, and blight, and to restore neighborhoods, and securing $6 billion for that program. She is lauded for her efforts to expand contracting and procurement opportunities and to strengthen businesses throughout our region. One testament to her work is the Maxine Waters Employment Preparation Center, a multi-million-dollar campus providing education and employment opportunities to residents of the Watts area. She is married to Mr. Sidney Williams, the former U.S. Ambassador to the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. She is the mother of 2 adult children, Edward and Karen, and has 2 grandchildren. So please join me in welcoming Congresswoman Maxine Waters, our dear friend.
Good afternoon. Reclaiming my time. I am delighted to be here, and I want to thank Jonathan Buehler for the kind introduction. And of course, we all just love Lori Latham Brandt, and we thank her for her service, but we thank her for her beer also. And then there's my dear friend, the CEO of the Chamber, Donna Duperon, a woman who spends all of her time making sure this is the most active chamber in the state. And it is. She keeps everybody busy. She's on top of all of the issues, and we can count on her to make sure that we all understand what is going on in the business community and how it can be assisted by the chamber. Another round of applause for Donna. She deserves it. And of course, I'd like to thank the entire Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce for the invitation to address you today. The roles that the chambers of commerce play throughout the country are essential, and I have a great appreciation for all of the chambers in this region. So ladies and gentlemen, I am so pleased to be joined by my friend and colleague, Congressman Ted Lieu, who will also be addressing you today. And I want to thank and recognize all of the elected officials in the room. Give all of the elected officials a big round of applause. We have a whole list of community leaders who are listed here today in my notes. I'm not going to try and call on all of them except to say thank you for your leadership. Thank you for the work that you do in the South Bay. So I'm very honored to be with all of you today. This is a vibrant, diverse, and dynamic, thriving region filled with incredible people, brilliant and hardworking entrepreneurs, businesses that innovate, and local leaders who understand the importance of constantly investing in our communities. We have aerospace companies, a multitude of service industries, import and export businesses, and even microbreweries. And we can attribute a lot of that success to our mayor of the city of Torrance, Pat Fury. Give him a big round of applause. And of course, he certainly would not be successful without the support of his wonderful wife, Terry. Give her a big round of applause also. As I proudly represent this region in Congress, I'm working to support the programs and projects that are important to our communities. At the same time, I've been fighting for public policies that will allow this region to continue to thrive. There's a lot going on in Washington, D.C. right now, as you might well imagine. It's hard to know where to start. I know that there's tremendous uncertainty about the state of affairs in Washington, D.C., and how it will impact our region. There is uncertainty as to whether there will be resolution to several public policy issues that have been long debated. There's also uncertainty as to the effects of recent changes in the tax laws and how the government will deal with the national debt. As you know, a great deal of uncertainty in the past year has been due to a lack of clarity as to the long-term federal funding for programs and projects. It is not only important to federal agencies and federal employees that there be clarity in the long-term funding of programs. It is also important to states and localities as well, as individuals and families depend on those programs and services. A specific area in which I have advocated for a significant federal investment is infrastructure. I'm working hard to expand federal support for infrastructure in communities nationwide. A few months ago, I introduced a legislative package consisting of 2 bills, which will provide $15 billion for over the next 6 years for job creation through investments in our nation's infrastructure. The Transportation Infrastructure for Job Creation Act that I introduced would provide a supplemental appropriation of $7.5 billion over the next 6 years for investments in transportation infrastructure through the U.S. Department of Transportation's popular Tiger Grants program. This bill would provide additional funding for innovative highway and transit projects by local governments and transit agencies like the Torrance Transit and Gardenia's G-Trans. The Drinking Water Infrastructure for Job Creation Act would provide a supplemental appropriation of $7.5 billion over the next 6 years for the Drinking Water State Revolving Funds, which help public water systems finance infrastructure projects in order to replace lead pipes, upgrade water infrastructure, and ensure clean drinking water for American families. A safe, efficient, modern, and accessible transportation system and access to safe, clean drinking water is vital for a healthy environment and a vibrant economy. This is true here in the South Bay and in communities throughout the United States. Let's talk a little bit about Torrance transportation. I'm especially proud of the city of Torrance and its commitment to public transportation. Torrance Transit, the city's municipal transportation agency, has been serving the needs of the South Bay residents for over 75 years. Torrance Transit operates 11 different bus routes and connects with several regional transit hubs and services system-wide. Torrance Transit experiences approximately 3.9 million passenger boardings every year. I've worked closely with Kim Turner, the director of Torrance Transit, to support Torrance Transit's work and make certain that Torrance Transit's priorities receive their fair share of federal, state, and local funding. In fiscal year 2014, I helped Torrance Transit obtain $175,000 for the construction of a compressed natural gas fueling station. This funding, go ahead. This funding was provided by the Mobile Source Air Pollution Reduction Review Committee, which brings together representatives of several local and regional transit agencies. In fiscal year 2016, I helped Torrance Transit obtain $64,000 for the construction of 8 electric vehicle charging stations. The funding was provided by the Southern California Air Quality Management District, and the electric vehicle charging stations will be located at the Torrance Transit Park and Ride Regional Terminal, a strategically located multimodal transit center that will connect several modes of transportation in the South Bay. Furthermore, as a strong supporter of the Transportation Department's Tiger Grants program, I wrote several letters over the past few years supporting Torrance Transit's efforts to obtain federal Tiger funding to support the construction of the Park and Ride Regional Terminal. The Tiger Grants program is a highly competitive federal program that provides financing to local transit agencies for innovative highway and transit projects, and I strongly believe that Torrance Transit's Park and Ride embodies the type of innovative thinking that Tiger was designed to promote. Unfortunately, Torrance Transit was unsuccessful in obtaining a Tiger grant because of the limited federal funding available. Nevertheless, I'm working to expand federal funding for Tiger so that more projects like the Park and Ride will be able to obtain Tiger support in the future. Separately, I've sought support from both the U.S. Department of Transportation and the California Air Resources Board for Torrance Transit's plans to develop its proposed return of the red car trolley service. This zero-emission, all-electric rubber tire trolley service would start and end at the Park and Ride and further expand access to transit service in the South Bay. While not all of these efforts were successful, Torrance Transit is expected to receive more than $16 million in federal support through transportation formula grants for the period between fiscal year 2014 and fiscal year 2018. I mentioned about some other efforts in the Bay Area, Gardena Transportation. I'm very proud to represent the city of Gardena also, which operates G-Trans, formerly known as Gardena Bus Lines. Over the past 4 years, I've written several letters to federal, state, and regional agencies in support of funding for G-Trans priorities, including G-Trans's compressed natural gas fueling facility and maintenance infrastructure, upgrades projects, and its solar energy-powered zero-emission bus transit system project. These projects illustrate the city of Gardena's commitment to transition to a fleet of low-emission, clean energy buses while providing efficient bus service to the South Bay region. Finally, I helped Metro obtain a federal bus and bus facilities grant for $10.5 million to replace about 30 aging diesel buses with new low-emission, clean fuel buses for uses specifically in the South Bay region. A little bit about Torrance water infrastructure. Just learning a lot about Torrance water infrastructure as I learn about beer. Don't ever complain if you have a little hard water, because it's hard water that makes good beer, okay? Water infrastructure is also critical for the South Bay region. The Torrance Municipal Water Department serves more than 100,000 residents and business customers, covering 78% of the city. I supported the city's efforts to serve its municipal water customers by seeking federal funding for the North Torrance Well Field Project, a comprehensive project to design and construct new water infrastructure. Just 2 weeks ago, I sought federal funding for the Torrance Airport Storm water infiltration project, which will be installed at the Torrance Municipal Airport, and the Walnut Storm water capture and groundwater replenishment basin project, which will develop infrastructure to divert stormwater to an above-ground storage basin and increase local water supplies. These two funding requests are still pending. Now, I know this doesn't sound sexy, and I know you thought I was going to come and tell you really what was going on behind the scenes in Washington, D.C. However, I want to be a nice girl today. And so I want to tell you about some things that's good for Torrance. We'll talk about Washington at another time. A little bit about what's happening over in Inglewood. Like many of the other cities in this region, Inglewood is flourishing as well. There's exciting news of development projects in Inglewood that will allow that city and the surrounding area to thrive. Most notably, as you know, Inglewood is poised to become home to 3 professional sports teams. The Rams and the Chargers are moving into a new football stadium in Inglewood. The project includes football stadium, retail space, office space, a hotel, and other features that will make a huge impact on the community. For example, since the Rams announced they were moving to Inglewood, the city's median home price increased dramatically from $398,000 in January 2016 to $448,000 in March 2017. The owners of the property where the stadium is being built have estimated that the stadium project could create as many as 40,000 new jobs, counting construction and ongoing operations. The Clippers are also on the verge of a move to Inglewood. Just this Tuesday, February 20th, we learned new details of the Clippers' proposal to build a world-class basketball arena, practice facility, and entertainment center complex in Inglewood. This event would host sports events and concerts and would make a huge impact on the city and the surrounding region. I'm determined to advocate for additional federal investments in our communities and in infrastructure so that additional funding is available for transportation and infrastructure projects in the South Bay communities and across the country. Lately, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion about infrastructure at the national level. Last week, on February 12th, the President released the administration's fiscal year 2019 budget proposal along with a plan that is purportedly intended to leverage $1.5 trillion in infrastructure spending over 10 years. However, the President's plan provides only $200 billion in federal infrastructure funding over 10 years, and it's going to rely on states and Mr. Mayor, local governments, and private investors for the rest of the funding. And so I'm concerned about that. Of the $200 billion, the plan makes $100 billion available as an incentive for states and local governments, which would have to provide an 80% match. For comparison purposes, the 1956 law signed by Republican President Eisenhower that built the interstate highway system provided 90% of highway construction costs, while the states were required to pay only a 10% match. Most states and local governments will not be able to finance 80% of the cost of a major infrastructure project, so they will not benefit from this plan. But of course, we're going to fight about that. We're going to see what we can do about that. Of the remaining funds made available in the President's plan, $50 billion would go to rural communities and would not be accessible to our region. Another $20 billion would be made available for federal loans to attract private investment, which could result in private companies building toll roads. The remaining funds would go to other activities. At the same time, the President's budget reduces transportation and infrastructure funding in his budget by $168 billion over 10 years. Highway, transit, and highway safety funding is cut by $122 billion over 10 years. In addition, the budget proposes to eliminate the U.S. Department of Transportation's popular Tiger Grants program that I just talked about, which funds investments in transportation infrastructure by states and local transit agencies like Metro, Torrance Transit, and Gardenia's G-Trans. Overall, the budget proposal released last week would cut fiscal year 2019 transportation funding by 14% below the fiscal year 2017 level. Now, if you hear some contradictions here about the so-called infrastructure plan that's being presented by the president and these cuts that you hear in the Department of Transportation, you're hearing correctly. There are contradictions, and of course, we're going to fight about that too. I think there will be a robust conversation in Washington over the upcoming weeks and months about transportation and infrastructure funding and the appropriate amount of federal investments. I've long advocated for additional federal transportation and infrastructure investments. At the center of the discussion will be an examination of how the federal government can invest in infrastructure without shifting the burden to states and local communities to come up with an unrealistic and unreasonable share of the funding. A word about what is going on and you should be concerned about as it relates to our beach and coastal communities' offshore oil drilling. The president's decision to open up the entire Pacific coastline to offshore oil drilling is also causing a robust debate in Washington. I believe this decision would have a devastating impact upon California, especially for coastal cities in the South Bay, like Manhattan Beach, Redondo Beach, and Hermosa Beach. Offshore oil drilling is opposed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities throughout California. California families and small businesses depend on the health of our oceans for food, commerce, and a thriving tourism industry. An offshore oil disaster like the Deepwater Horizon oil spill would be severely damaging for our state. I strongly oppose the president's decision, and I'm working with my colleagues to protect our coastline from offshore drilling. We're going to fight about that too. So I was asked to talk about infrastructure and transportation and water, but also immigration. As you know, aside from the debate on federal spending, infrastructure investments, and offshore oil drilling, one of the most contentious and robust public policy debates in Washington, D.C. is on the topic of immigration. Again, this is an area of uncertainty in which affected immigrants, businesses, state and local governments, and the various stakeholders on all sides of the debate are desperate for long-term clarity in law. Recently, much of the discussion has centered on the continuation of the Deferred Action for Children arrivals. You have been hearing a lot about the DACA program, which the administration announced would be phased out by March 5th, 2018. Nationally, there are about 800,000 DACA participants. These participants are people who came to America as children, innocent of any wrongdoing. They're paying taxes, passed a background check, and are valued and active members of our society and contributors to our economy. About a quarter of these individuals live in California, and roughly 13% live in this region. Outside of just DACA and referring to immigrants in general, there are roughly 2.5 million green card and visa holders living in the state. The American Immigration Council estimates that nearly 34% of California's entire labor force is foreign-born, as are 40% of business owners in the Los Angeles, Long Beach, Anaheim metropolitan area. Immigrants are our neighbors, business owners, employees, and taxpayers. It is to everyone's benefit, immigrant and natural-born citizens alike, to reform our immigration system to, at the very best, establish some certainty in law. Reforming our nation's immigration law is not a new endeavor. Over the last several years and over the last few presidential administrations, there have been attempts at bipartisan agreements on immigration reform. For example, in 2004, during President George W. Bush's administration, Senator John McCain and late Senator Edward M. Kennedy, among others, got together, and among other provisions, that bill that they put forward offered a path to citizenship for undocumented immigrants, increase border security, and address hiring practices regarding undocumented immigrants. The Senate bill passed, it passed the Senate, but did not pass the House, despite being supported by President Bush. We then crossed into the Obama administration, where there was significant discussion, but again, no successful legislation. Perhaps the most notable attempt at immigration legislation during that time frame was in 2013, when the Gang of Eight, a bipartisan group of senators, introduced a bill that would have made it possible for millions of undocumented immigrants to gain legal status while also putting them on a 13-year path to citizenship. However, at the same time, that bill also included increased border security and repealed the diversity visa lottery program, which gives a limited number of visas to immigrants from underrepresented countries. That bill died in the 113th Congress. Those were some conservative attempts at reaching bipartisan compromise. Many people across the country on both sides of the aisle are hopeful that the conversation on immigration, which reached a fever pitch in the last month, would spark legislative action that would resolve the years of lingering uncertainty with respect to our immigration system. However, we appear to have returned to the persistent stalemate that has existed on many of these issues. Last week, the Senate engaged in a debate on the issue of immigration. Although the prospects had seemed promising that a bipartisan compromise bill could pass the Senate failed to advance any of the 4 immigration proposals before it last Thursday. Those proposals included a deal that was spearheaded by Senator Susan Collins, which was considered by many to be the legislation with the best chance of passing. That bill offered a path to citizenship to DACA eligible immigrants, provided as much as $25 billion for border security, and maintained the diversity visa lottery program. While that particular bill, like the other proposals on the table, failed to achieve the 60 votes necessary to advance, that bill had the support of a bipartisan group of at least 54 senators. Unfortunately, it seems as though we may not be close to a resolution on this issue that will pass both the House and the Senate and become enacted into law. Nevertheless, I, like many of my colleagues, strongly believe that there is a need for urgent action, and I will continue to be engaged in this issue. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to get this right. We've got to understand what we can do to understand who makes up our populations in the United States. What should they have to do to become legal citizens? What we're going to do about DACA, these young people who are here through no fault of their own. It looks as if the President of the United States is about to get $25 billion to build a wall in exchange for giving some help to the DACA young people in this country. It looks to me that that's the way that it's going. A little bit more about tax, and then I'm going to be finished. I remember last year, I went over my time. I was trying not to do that this time, but of course I got a lot to talk about. So, while immigration and infrastructure are two of the unresolved policy debates in Washington, D.C., a great deal of the uncertainty of this past year has related to the debate over the new tax law. California faces unique challenges under this new law, which many economists are suggesting that it will negatively affect our growth and harm the state's competitiveness. The new law, which was enacted late last year, reduces or eliminates key deductions that are relied on by Californians. It is expected to raise the cost of living for many middle-class households. Some of the most important changes in the tax law are alterations to the state and local tax deduction, or SALT as we refer to it, and the mortgage interest rate deduction. These two changes greatly affect California. Before the new tax law, taxpayers could deduct everything they pay in state and local income, property, and sales tax. The new law caps SALT to $10,000 for income, property, and sales tax combined. Approximately 3 million Californians already pay more than $10,000 a year in state taxes. In California, 34% of people claim the deduction, including 29% of tax filers right here in my congressional district. The average value of the SALT deduction for a California household that claims it is over $18,000. Before the new tax law, if you itemize your deductions, you could write off qualifying mortgage interest payments for real estate purchases for up to $1 million. This $1 million cap used to apply not only to a primary residence, but also a second home. The new law reduced the mortgage interest rate deduction by 25%, which has a particularly significant impact on California and specifically homeowners in this region and other high-cost cities. From January to October of 2017, approximately 10% of all new home loans in California were over the new $750,000 cap. Notably, the new cap is less than the median home value in Torrance, which is $812,400. In addition to the changes in deductions, the new tax law significantly increases the national deficit. The amount of projected debt added to the deficit is at least $1.5 trillion over the next decade, with some economists estimating that it could be significantly higher than that, even over $2 trillion. Some have argued that those estimates don't account for economic growth created by the law, but the bipartisan Joint Congressional Committee on Taxation has estimated that the law still adds at least $1 trillion to the deficit, even when accounting for economic growth. Adding too much to the deficit, especially this fast, can have severe negative consequences on our economy in the long term. This type of deficit spending is not sustainable. As a ranking member of the Financial Services Committee, I will be monitoring the deficit closely, and I will advocate policies that will help keep the economy stable and support working families. I will also do everything in my power to fight for the people of California and make certain they are not unfairly disadvantaged by the new tax law. Let me just say this. For those in the room who represent big corporations, you'll be happy. You'll be happy because the big corporations of America got their tax responsibilities reduced from 35% to 21%. And so when you hear that some of our big companies are given bonuses, which may be one time, it's because they've been favored in the tax bill. And when you hear that some of them are going to increase the minimum wage and all of that, even more perhaps than has been indicated by their state law, et cetera, it's because they are making out very, very well. Not so true for some of the smaller businesses and for the average middle class family. However, as I talk about all of this, I don't want to just seem that I'm talking about doom and gloom, because I think that the House of Representatives and the Senate is going to change in 2018 and in 2020, and we're going to do away with a lot of this stuff, okay? We're going to change it. So in conclusion, many of the issues and problems facing this country require immediate attention. Inaction or the wrong action on infrastructure, immigration, public transportation, and the national deficit, among other issues, is not sustainable. Action and solutions are required. I fought long and hard for these solutions, and I will not stop until the South Bay region and other communities in our district are better off than they are even today. In conclusion, I want to say thank you to the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce for your continued commitment as a leading business advocate in the South Bay region. I look forward to working collaboratively with you in my capacity as your representative of California's 43rd District and in my position as ranking member of the House Financial Services Committee. I remain committed to fighting for this region to ensure that every resident can live the American dream. And included in my conclusion, I want to say a word about some things that you will be very proud of. LA Betromed. David Meyer, I think, is in the room, the president and CEO of LA Biomed, has done a wonderful thing. This biomed program discovered a drug called Indari. It is the first treatment for sickle cell disease by the FDA that's been authorized by the FDA in 20 years. It was developed right here in the 43rd Congressional District by LA Biomed under the director of Dr. Yutaka Nahara, and it will alleviate the symptoms of sickle cell, drastically reduce hospitalization costs, and it will also ease the suffering of many men and women and children throughout the world. Would you give David Meyer and LA Biomed a big round of applause? Is that wonderful or what? I have some other good news. We have with us today someone that I'm extremely proud of, and I was hoping that he would have brought the annual support to you today for 2016. Jan Vogel is doing a fantastic job for all of the South Bay. It is the South Bay Workforce Investment Board, and they just got involved in something that's very, very wonderful. The South Bay Workforce Investment Board has gotten involved in something known as Aeroflex. It is a team of employers and partners who have successfully requested and been awarded the first aerospace engineering apprenticeship occupation in the United States of America. Please give Jan Vogel a big round of applause. And I will end this by telling you this. You see this poster board here. This is the depiction of the new Alzheimer's stamp that I am responsible for getting into law, a way by which we can raise more research money to deal with Alzheimer's. 2017, the direct costs for Alzheimer's to our constituency, to our nation, to our taxpayers, was $259 billion. 2/3 of that was paid by Medi-Cal and Medicare. 1.1 trillion is the cost, or was the cost, or will be the cost, by 2050. And this is what we've been doing. We increased research by $600 million in 2015. We increased it by $900 million in 2016. I'm asking for $1.4 billion. Actually, I'm asking for $1.8 billion. We already increased it by $1.4 billion. This is so important because if we don't get a handle on research and understand how to prevent and how to save lives, we will not be able to afford the cost of dealing with Alzheimer's in the next 10 years or so. We just won't be able to afford it. So, you see this stamp? It will cost you about 65 cents. That's more than the regular stamp, which I think is about 50 cents. But for every penny that you spend on this stamp, It will now go into research. And we know that we can raise more money. We saw the cancer research operation do it. They raised millions of dollars. Now it's time for us to focus on what we can do about Alzheimer's. And I just want to say this to you. We're all going to age. It happens. And along come other kinds of diseases with aging, some of which we can handle, we can deal with. We've found cures for all of that. If we want to be very active and productive in our maturing years, we've got to have money for research for Alzheimer's, because I know it can be done. I believe it can be done, and I'm going to fight for that too. And I know you're saying she's going to fight for everything. Yeah, I am. That's what I'm going to do. Thank you very, very much.
On behalf of the Board of Directors, Congressman Waters, we'd like to say thank you so much for always supporting the Chamber and always being a champion for all the causes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
And go buy those Alzheimer's stamps.
Okay, that's right.
At this time, I'd like to invite Tara O'Brien of Kaiser Permanente South Bay, who will introduce our next speaker.
Thank you, Lori. It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. Ted Lieu was elected to represent California's 33rd Congressional District in the United States House of Representatives in 2014, succeeding retiring 40-year incumbent Henry Waxman. In 2016, Congressman Lieu was reelected and currently serves on the House Judiciary Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee. Ted has been an outspoken proponent for tackling climate change. He is frequently sought out for his insight on technology and innovation matters, including cybersecurity and cloud computing. He has been a leader against ethnic and racial profiling and discrimination against the LGBT community. He has sponsored numerous pieces of legislation that were signed into law, including bills to provide housing for homeless veterans and to retrofit vacant buildings at the West LA VA campus, and legislation combating foreign propaganda and misinformation. Ted is a former active duty officer in the U.S. Air Force and currently serves as a colonel in the reserves stationed at Los Angeles Air Force Base. He lives with his wife and 2 sons here in Torrance, where he first started his elected career as a member of the Torrance City Council. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Congressman Ted Lieu.
Thank you, Tara, for that wonderful introduction, and for Kaiser for your sponsorship of this event and the amazing things you do in healthcare. I want to say a few words about my amazing colleague, Maxine Waters. I've known her for nearly 2 decades since I was a locally elected official. As you can tell from her energy and her grace and presence, she actually doesn't age. And I'm always thrilled to see her husband, Sidney. As some of you may know, I'm a long-suffering Cleveland Browns fan. He actually played for the Cleveland Browns, and we're all rooting for next season because, in fact, if the team wins just 1 game, it's infinitely better than this season. Want to thank Lori Brandt for your leadership of the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce. I've gone to Red Car Brewery numerous times. Their chicken piccata dish is very good. And then every now and then, if you go on one of these mystery days, you can get their jambalaya, which is actually quite good. Or you can call her in advance, and she'll make sure that it's there. I also want to thank Donna Dupron for your amazing work on the Chamber of Commerce. I knew Donna when I did one of the hardest things in my life. I ran Leadership Torrance for the Torrance Chamber of Commerce. And yes, anyone who's done that knows it's extremely difficult. And thank you for all that you've done. And to the amazing City Council and Mayor Fury and Terry for letting him do this. To your city treasurer, to your city clerk, and city staff and officials. I had a great time and an honorable time serving on Torrance City Council. As some of you may know, as a member of Congress, you could actually live anywhere. So I could live in Idaho and represent the 33rd Congressional District in California. But my wife and I choose to live in Torrance because we love this city. It's safe, it's fun, it's prosperous. So thank you for all that you do. And our 2 kids go to Torrance Unified Schools because it's a great school district. My son, by the way, is on their South High robotics team. I don't want to get them in trouble, but I just want to say, staying up to 3 a.m., not so good. But they got it done. Okay. So I'm going to talk about 3 topics today. First will be infrastructure, and then I'm going to talk about North Korea, because it turns out that nuclear war is not good for business. And then I'm going to talk about cybersecurity, because it affects all of you. So in terms of infrastructure, Congresswoman Waters did a great job talking about it. I want to add on to what she said. So last term, I worked with a bipartisan group of Southern California members of Congress, including Congresswoman Waters, and we fought for and got full Phase 1 funding for Metro's request to build out its light rail and subway. And in fact, as we stand here today, they actually are doing a groundbreaking and celebration of their Purple Line. That's going to right now extend through Beverly Hills and then keep on going eventually to the West LA VA. And then we're trying to get additional phases of funding and eventually get light rail down to the South Bay. And so we're fighting for that on a bipartisan basis, and it's something that's proceeding well. When I was in the California State Legislature, I worked with then Senator Jenny Oropeza, and we got authorization and initial funding for light rail to go into LAX. So at the time I thought, oh, this is great, and maybe my grandchildren will see that happen. Well, it turns out it's happening now, so it's very exciting to see that they are building light rail. I would have preferred light rail to go directly to LAX for different design reasons. They decided it was better to have it set aside from it, not directly in, and then move people into the airport. But regardless, it's going to be a much better transportation system than we have now. In terms of infrastructure overall, last year I worked on an infrastructure bill with other Democratic colleagues, and we introduced a $2 trillion infrastructure plan. And at the time, some of my colleagues in my own party, not Maxine Waters, she supported it, but some other folks thought, that's too much, that's too expensive. But then you look at the facts, and the American Society of Civil Engineers has issued a report saying we've got a $4.5 trillion infrastructure budget over the next 10 years. And then we were all very pleased when the President in the State of the Union put out the number 1.5 trillion. And we're like, see, we're all in the same ballpark. While there's different ways of trying to fund this, at least the White House recognizes the scale of the problem. And I think that's the first step, that we all understand the problem we're dealing with, to make sure we repair our roads, bridges, and highways, right? We can't actually have bridges that start falling down. And eventually that's going to happen if we continue to neglect some of this critical infrastructure. We're also in the 21st century, and my view is we need to have broadband everywhere, including in rural areas. And then we need to protect our critical assets with cybersecurity. There's been reports of dams that have been breached. That is not good. And so we need to make sure when we think of infrastructure, I think to have a cyber component as well. So this is something I think we can work with the White House on. Hopefully we can, as Congressman Waters says, fight and then get a good deal out of it. So we are working along that path, and happy to answer any questions after this if you have specific questions about specific projects. So let me tell you now about North Korea. I'm going to explain to you the problem. There's 2 problems. First problem is they are continuing to develop an ICBM capability that eventually will allow them to then put a nuclear warhead on it, miniaturize it, and then detonate it on the continental United States. They're not there yet. They can likely launch a missile over that likely will strike somewhere in the US, but they don't quite have the technology yet to miniaturize the warhead, to mount it on to make sure the warhead survives re-entry and to have it detonate. But in a few years or more, they will get that capability. So that is a major problem. The second problem, and I'll start by saying I served on active duty at Anderson Air Force Base in Guam, and we at the time did a whole series of military exercises, much of it directed against North Korea, and there are exactly 0 good military options. So that is the second problem. We've got this North Korean growing threat. We have 0 military options that are good to deal with it. And let me sort of walk you through why we have 0 good military options. First thing is we have very little intelligence about this regime. We don't actually know where all their nuclear weapons are. We don't even know how many they have. So last year, Congressman Ruben Gallego and I wrote a letter to the Pentagon saying, look, your stated objective is to denuclearize North Korea. If you want to do this by force, how would you do it? And they wrote us back a very frank letter. Like when we read it, we thought, we think they actually want us to publish this and let the American people know. So we did. And it basically said, we're gonna need a full-on ground invasion. So this is not one of those scenarios like Syria, where the US can just launch 59 cruise missiles and walk away. We would need a ground invasion with lots of troops. They need to locate these nuclear weapons and then disable them, secure them, or destroy them. If we don't do that in the first few days of the war, we are in big trouble because they can detonate them. They could detonate them in South Korea, where in any given day, we have over 200,000 Americans, as well as millions of South Koreans. They could potentially launch them at Guam or in Japan, where we have a lot more Americans as well. So let's set aside the nuclear issue. If we just look at their other weapons, public reports indicate that North Korea has up to 5,000 tons of chemical weapons. When I was in Guam, we would do these exercises where we had to put on these chemical weapon suits. I hated doing that because one, it was hot. So Guam is hot, right? And then you put on this suit that makes you even hotter. It was bulky, it was difficult to walk around in it, difficult to see. But I remember every time I did this, I thought, well, it's nice I have this suit. And 99% of the people on this island do not. So that would happen in South Korea. They could just start launching chemical weapons over, and the lucky few who can get to a suit in time, put it on, they might survive, but a lot of people are gonna die from chemical weapons or get severely injured. Well, let's set chemical weapons aside. Just on their sheer conventional weapons, they have huge amounts of artillery, rockets, and other conventional arms aimed at South Korea. 20 million people are within striking distance of those weapons. They could just start firing off artillery shells, destroy lots of buildings, destroy lots of people. So I also got a letter from the former US Deputy Forces Commander of US Forces Korea. And on my Twitter account is actually the first thing you see. I pinned it there, and there's a letter. And he says some very interesting things. He says, look, in this war, in the first week, we're just gonna have a lot of losses. And it's because, unlike all our other previous engagements, we actually cannot build up our forces. So in Iraq, if you remember, months, right? We were sending over tanks, sending over troops. We were building up our forces for an eventual attack. The problem we have right now is we only have 28,500 US troops in South Korea. South Korea itself has about 500,000 troops. North Korea has over 1.1 million. So we start off outgunned, outmanned, and we cannot reinforce. Because the minute we start evacuating people and shipping over tanks and other things, North Korea will attack South Korea, because they'll know that we're about to launch a war. So in the first week, we're just gonna suffer these losses. We're gonna try to get reinforcements in. And predictions from third-party nonprofit organizations show that in a worst-case scenario, 2.2 million people could die, 7.7 million people injured. So that's the other side of this problem, right? You have two huge problems. So my view is we should look at the following potential solutions. You all remember during World War II, the US government basically made it the #1 priority to develop the Manhattan Project and to develop a nuclear weapon, and we succeeded. My view is we need to do a Manhattan Project for a defensive system that will prevent a nuclear weapon from landing on us. So I'm a big proponent of missile defense. There has been some amazing advancements in directed energy in the last several years. It's a fancy word for lasers. And by the way, it's so advanced now that the Army and Navy have contracted for lasers to mount on their ships and on their equipment to blow things up, to kill people, to destroy things. At some point, I believe we'll get to a point where these solid-state lasers will be strong enough to destroy an ICBM launching up in boost phase. And then you could have these unmanned drones that are far enough away from North Korea that they won't get shot down. They could just sort of hover there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it would be an anti-missile defensive system. So right now, we're not there yet. But North Korea also can't launch a bunch of ICBMs with nuclear warheads on us right now either. I don't want the case to be where 5 years from now they could, and we're still not there yet. So I am pleased that there is additional funding in the budget for missile defense, and hopefully we'll see the technological advancements go ahead with it. I had this tour of Northrop Grumman, by the way, last week. I saw their amazing space telescope. And I also told them that, hey, we needed that missile defense system 2 years ago. So they're working on it. It's not their fault. This is very complicated. Other thing we need to do is we need to explore, I think, every possible diplomatic option. And then we need to let economic sanctions have time to take their effect. I voted for, and Congressman Waters voted for, the strongest sanctions ever on North Korea. But that does take some time. I think we have to let that play its course. And it's not helpful for the administration and the president to issue threatening statements in the interim, because what we want to prevent is a fatal miscalculation. Some of you may have read the administration's thinking about doing something called a bloody nose strike, which essentially would mean that we would in fact use military force first against North Korea, maybe destroy a launch pad or do something, and hopefully that will cause North Korea to stop what they're doing. My personal view is I think that's a bad idea. Partly because we don't know how they're going to react. We know they're a very paranoid regime. We know that they believe the U.S. is going to attack them. And in fact, if we do attack them, they may go, oh my goodness, we're getting attacked, and they may go berserk, or they may not. But that is a pretty big risk. We just don't know. But the other problem is, I think it matters a lot how a conflict starts, if there were to be a conflict, in terms of what Russia or China would do. You may recall in the first Korean War, Russia and China did not support us. They supported North Korea. I believe if we initiated military force against North Korea, China, Russia may very well, again, not support us. If that were to happen, if they were to in fact support North Korea, it is game over. We do not win that war. If North Korea were to initiate military force, I think that's a different story. So I think we have to think about what that means if we were to go in first and do something. So that's where we are. There's not a lot of good options, but I do think we still have some time. We are not at imminent threat. And by the way, we right now also have a missile defensive system that is kinetic, that doesn't rely on lasers. And according to the U.S. Missile Defense Agency, if North Korea shot 1 or 2 ICBMs, we could handle it. We would essentially fire 4 of these anti-defensive missiles. They're actually based in California and Alaska, and we could likely take those down. So we're not at an imminent threat, but we will get there at some point. And I understand the impulse to want to attack North Korea. It is not irrational. If your view is that it is unacceptable for the North Korean regime to have an ICBM with a nuclear warhead that can strike Los Angeles, you would eventually attack them, because there's really no other way to try to stop that. But let me sort of give this view for those who think that that's the only option. On any given day, right, we can be annihilated by countries like Russia and China. Only reason that doesn't happen is we deter them. We deter them with our triad of ICBMs, of bombers, of nuclear submarines. So if your view is that North Korea can be deterred, if your view is that he is not, the leader of North Korea is not suicidal, then that's something you would consider, that okay, we could try to deter North Korea the same way we deter China and Russia. So a lot just depends on your point of view on that. I know our U.S. intelligence agencies have assessed that the North Korean leader is in fact not suicidal. They don't actually believe he's building an ICBM for the purpose of dropping a nuclear warhead on Chicago. They believe he's doing it because in his mind, countries that don't have that capability get attacked by the U.S. And there's a little bit of truth to that, right? We took out Saddam Hussein, we took out Gaddafi in Libya. So it's also not irrational, I think, what they're doing. But that's the state of affairs, and my hope is we at least try to exhaust every other possible option before we talk about a dark and bloody war that we don't know how it might end. So I'm going to conclude on something less dark, but equally troubling. All right. So it's cybersecurity. So this one won't actually kill you, but it may cost you some money. All right. So in terms of cybersecurity, we are very far behind compared to what both criminal hackers and foreign governments can do to us. And some of you have heard me tell you this story about a 60 Minutes interview that I was in. So last term, 60 Minutes called my office up and said to my staff, hey, we want to hack your boss's cell phone. And they were thrilled. They said, great, we'd love you to do that. But 60 Minutes was nice. They didn't actually want to mess up my personal cell phone. So they brought an Apple iPhone off the shelf, gave it to me, and I opened it, and they said, keep this for about a week. We're going to try and hack it. So I kept it for a week. I was in Washington, D.C. Then I came back to the South Bay. Then I went back to D.C. for the interview. And first thing they did is they sat me down, and they played back recordings I had of conversations with my staff, with other people. They actually showed me on a map everywhere I went, even though they had told me to turn GPS off. They also told me they could acquire text messages in real time. It was deeply disturbing and very troubling. And it's something called the signaling system number 7 flaw. If you look on the internet for SS7 flaw, it's the first thing that pops up. And it's something that you can't do very much about because it's not your phone. It's actually in the networks. So what happened is many decades ago when they set up these telephone networks, they were all operating under this system known as a trusted network. And it turns out if you have a telephone network, you can, in fact, listen in real time on anyone's cell phone just knowing their cell phone number. It also turns out that some folks who have these telephone networks include North Korea, Iran, Russia, other adversaries of US, or criminal syndicates associated with it. So if you just have one of these networks, they could listen in on you. Now the chances, right, of someone here getting a foreign government listening in on your cell phone is probably not that high, but maybe if you're a CEO, they might listen in. Or if you work in the State Department, or if you're making stock trades, or if you have insider information. So there's all sorts of nefarious things, right, that criminals and foreign governments can do. 2 days after the interview, the FCC said, okay, we're investigating this. So they investigated it, and then they issued a report a few months ago that basically said, yep, this is a problem. Hard to fix, so they're working with the telecom companies to try to address it. It is better now. So there were certain software things that these telecoms did that did make it better. Still not entirely fixed, so we keep pushing to try to get a fix to it. So now it turns out there's another problem, which is there are companies that, as their mission and business model, they write exploits. In other words, they write hacks for your phone and computer systems and so on. And they sell them to governments. And they would say, well, we're just doing this because, one, it's legal and we can sell it to governments. So I encourage you to, on the internet, search for Pegasus hack. So Pegasus was an exploit, a malware, a hack that this company, wholly owned by an American subsidiary based in Israel, wrote. And it was a very, very difficult to detect piece of malware. And in fact, if there was code in there that if it thought that you had detected it, it would basically erase itself. What it did is it would allow the operator of that hack to turn on your cell phone without you knowing it, turn on the microphone, turn on the camera, and track everything you did, and then feed that into their cloud-based server. And so a government brought that and was tracking some of their private citizens that they didn't like, that they thought were fomenting dissent. It also turns out that it's really hard to control these hacks once they're out there. So now they've discovered similar tools appearing in other governments that didn't buy this from this company, as well as criminal syndicates and terrorist networks. So there is a problem there. It's not the same, well, it's a little bit similar. So if a company, let's say, makes a Stinger missile and they sell it to a government, it is possible that that government would also transfer it to a terrorist network, but it's a little harder. There are controls on that. When you look at what I call these are cyber weapons, there's nothing, no regulations, no laws, no controls. And we're looking at legislation to say, okay, if you're going to develop these cyber weapons, you need to be regulated the same way as if this was a regular weapon. So for example, Lockheed Martin can't just make a weapon and then sell it whoever they want. The US government says, no, you gotta go through this process. We're not gonna let you sell it to these countries we don't like or these organizations that we don't like. So there's this whole sort of new area now where people are realizing, wow, there's these cyber weapons that could do a fair amount of damage and put private citizens at risk as well as a lot of people, because once this gets out, it gets replicated and who knows where it can stop. So we're looking at that issue. And then for many of you here, one of the easiest ways you get hacked is not going to be from a foreign government who purchased, by the way, these things cost between $1 to $5 million to purchase one of these things and get you to install on your phone. What ends up happening is the easiest way to get hacked is through something known as spoofing. So if you went to a place where there's public Wi-Fi, such as here, I don't mean to disparage this hotel. It's a great hotel. Their chocolate chip cookies are great. It's good. All right. Let's talk about Starbucks. Let's say you go to Starbucks and you sit there and you want to log into their Wi-Fi and 3 options come up. Starbucks 1, Starbucks _1, Starbucks 2. Would you know which one was the right one? Maybe all 3 are right. Maybe 2 of the 3 are right. But if you guessed wrong and one of those things was not correct, it could be a hacker sitting in the same Starbucks who just got all your information, literally in seconds. So my advice to you is don't ever log on to public Wi-Fi unless you're very clear that you know that exact address is correct. So one thing I do is I carry a Wi-Fi hotspot with me. You can, any of these stores sell them. You get AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, and so on. And it's a little thing. And then you have your own Wi-Fi, and it's much more secure. So that's my recommendation. Some of you also have your phone set up to automatically log on to Wi-Fi. I would not do that because you could walk past this Starbucks, log on, get hacked, and not even know it. So there are things you could do right now to try to secure your phone. And there's also apps out there that will provide some level of protection. So Lookout is something you could download. It is free, and it provides some basic protection. You can provide more protection by paying more money if you want, but at least the free basic version does some protection for you. And then let me conclude on this point on cybersecurity in the future. So there is not a lot of protection on this phone compared to your desktop, compared to your network servers at work. But if someone hacks it, it's not likely going to kill you or me. But imagine if someone hacked a driverless car. And we're going to see automated vehicles much sooner than later. We're already seeing them now. By the way, the very first automated truck delivery was actually a beer. So that worked. Las Vegas now is running automated shuttle. All these other cities are doing experiments. It has to do with something called deep learning. And so I'm also a recovering computer science major. And I remember when I was in college, there were these folks working on these things called neural networks and deep learning, and we thought, oh, they're sort of fringe. What they would say is, we want the computer to think like a human being. We're like, oh, that's never going to happen. Well, about 8 years ago, it did. And what would happen is you would take a computer, you'd feed it 10,000 pictures of cats. And then after a while, it would realize what's a cat and what's a dog and what's an elephant. A little bit scary. I remember talking to a USC computer science professor last year. We were at lunch, and he worked on deep learning as applied to facial recognition. Actually, he told me two things that are quite troubling. One is he said computers can recognize faces now better than human beings. And second, I said, well, how does it work? And he goes, well, at a very deep level, we don't know. Which is sort of troubling, right? Because actually what happens is the computer sets up these matrices. So what will happen is you feed it an image, and it just randomly assigns data points. And then it runs this image through 1,000 other matrices. And you feed another image. And at some point, these data points start shifting. And at the end of the day, it figures out, okay, based on these different weights and measurements, that's a cat. But they don't actually know how it got there from point one to the end point. So that's what's a little bit scary. But anyways, that is taking off, and that's what causes, for example, voice recognition to be pretty amazing. You can call United Airlines now, say whatever you want. You could be drunk, you could have a British accent, doesn't matter. They'll know that you said United Flight 1732. That's the same that's happening in automated vehicle technology, and that's why you're seeing these huge advancements, and we're going to see driverless vehicles much sooner rather than later. The problem is, for the full build-out to work, most systems have these driverless vehicles communicating. And once you allow it to communicate, you allow it to be hacked. So I've worked and am working with Republican Congressman Joe Wilson out of South Carolina. We've introduced legislation that basically says to these stakeholders, look, we want the federal government, automobile manufacturers, Silicon Valley, and other stakeholders to work together to make sure that cybersecurity technology advances at the same pace as deep learning, automated driving technology. Because the problem is, if a hacker takes control of your car while you're going 60 miles per hour on 405, it could kill you. It could kill other people. But imagine if a hacker controlled more than one car. And I remember having this meeting last term with this executive who I will not name, from a car company I will not name. And the person said, oh, we got that covered. All our commands come from this central place. I was like, huh, okay. So there's one central place controls all your cars. Well, that's great. What if it gets hacked? So imagine, right, a hacker was able to control a fleet of cars and then run it into a school playground. That would be your problem. Or you imagine if a hacker was able to figure out a way to install a virus on a car so that it said, okay, in year 2025, at 9 a.m. on January 1st, all these cars are going to accelerate to 100 miles per hour. It could cause a lot of damage. And so we're just trying to at least be one step ahead of what malicious people might do. And finally, you've got great people out there working on the defensive end of cybersecurity. I know Philip has a company that does that. I know there's other people here that have cybersecurity companies. And if you're a medium to large size business, you absolutely have to do this. If you're a small size business, you might want to consider it. And any business that has any amount of records, including governments, needs to consider this. And I'll conclude on this point, which is there is this hack that goes around where they essentially will lock up your files. It's called ransomware. And then they go to you, like for example, a hospital, and say, hey, you can't access all these medical files. Good luck on your next surgery. You pay us $50,000 in Bitcoin and we'll unlock those files for you. Happened to Hollywood Presbyterian Hospital. Last term, they made a payment, reportedly $17,000. We don't actually know how many other hospitals have had to do this. So I'm also working on legislation to try to get more reporting from not just hospitals, but other organizations. It turns out that police departments and law firms and other businesses with lots of records have also experienced similar hacks. So it's a brave new world out there. I just want you all to understand it. And with that, so honored you invited me to speak.
On behalf of the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce, please accept this gift. Token, the California Seas chocolates, of course. But we have real live
the
homeland.
happiest part of my speech. It's
Yeah.
right here.
But after hearing that, it's like real live Homeland. If anyone watches Homeland, that's exactly what's going on with ransomware right now in the show. But I just want to take this opportunity to thank everybody for coming. I want to thank our speakers, both of them, for their insightful remarks. It was very helpful hearing about what's going on in Washington, so thank you both very much. Our corporate sponsors, thank you so much for supporting this event. Linda Amato and her team for their professionalism and hospitality. Torrance City Cable for airing this event. And lastly, I'd like to thank the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce President, Donna Duperon, CEO, and her staff, Debbie Morgan, Leah Hamilton, some running around here. Thank you both very, very much. We really appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for coming and hope you have a great day. Thanks.